feel free to interrupt and ask a question. Alternatively, you can type your question in the box down below, and I'll do my best to glance down there every once in a while and pick up on a question if anybody has one. The purpose of the webinar today is to give you just a kind of a quick glimpse and some insights into the model that we'll be using during the workshop. This Jay Galbraith's STAR model. Jay was a research scientist at the center for some time, and along with Sue, they started this org design program. And so we want to, before this session gets started, we want everybody to have at least a little, stick your toe in the water kind of experience with the model, learn about the different parts and pieces of it, so that when we begin the seminar was it about a week or so, right? Everybody will have a pretty good idea of what each of the bubbles on the star means, what each of the points of the star is kind of referring to, and we can begin to dig into the material in a quicker, more efficient way at the beginning of the session. We also want to spend some time, once I get through the model, I want to try and talk about what are the 3 or 4 things that I would prioritize between now and when the session starts. Here's 2 or 3 things I think you really should do if you want to get the most out of the session. It's an investment of your time and money, and we want to make sure you get the best return out of that. So we want to talk about those, again, 3 or 4 things that might make the most sense. And lastly, again, as we're going through here, we want to be able to answer questions people have about the workshop, about the pre-work, about the model itself, and just give everybody a chance to get comfortable with some of these basics that we're going to be playing with for 3.5, 4 days there in February. Just to kind of step back, right? We talk about what does it mean to design an organization, and we've put up a little definition here to kind of frame the discussion. And designing organizations is, on the one hand, it's a process. So we can talk about design as a verb. It's a process. We're actually going to do some work. We're going to think about things. There's some steps that we're going to go through as we think about what's necessary to shift and change an organization's design. And that also means that design is a noun. So I can ask you, what is the design of your organization? And you're going to talk to me about those elements of the organization, the structures and systems and processes that are configured together, right, to achieve some valued outcome. And that outcome can be financial and business-oriented. It can be customer-oriented, as we get to talk about customer-centric kinds of organizations. It can be related to employee engagement and the extent to which you view workers as and employees as a stakeholder in the enterprise. And I think increasingly we're seeing organizations being asked to serve outcomes related to social and ecological issues. So we can talk about the extent to which you've designed an organization that is not only financially successful, but also socially and environmentally responsible. So the design it's an it, right? It's a noun, and we're going to use the STAR model to describe the design of the organization. We're going to talk about a process of self-design that represents the verb, and we're going to talk about designing an organization and what are the steps and frameworks and tools you can use to get people involved in thinking about what the right and proper design is. So we'll talk about it as a noun and a verb, and again, we're trying to achieve some valued outcome that can range, right? You have choices about the different kinds of outputs and things that you're trying to achieve. With that, the model we use, again, because Jay was a part of us, and because we think of all the org design models out there, it's just kind of the simplest and most elegant and most powerful. There are other models out there, McKinsey 7S probably being a very popular one. There's Nadler-Tushman models and Weisbord 6-box models. There's several models out there. They're all pretty similar, but soon I think that this one has some particular strengths that we try and share and leverage in the workshop. But we think it has some ways of talking about design and calling out some things specifically. I mean, for example, you could look at the reward element of the star there in the lower left-hand corner, and you look at the people point of the star, and you could say, well, why not combine those and talk about human resource issues? That's a good question. We like the idea that we're pulling out people and separating it from rewards, because rewards is an enormously powerful lever for design and change. And so calling it out as a really specific sort of piece of the star, we think has some advantages. If you look at the star talks about 6 things. We begin with strategy. We think that strategy, and we focus on strategy in the workshop because we think that's a cornerstone of design. We're really clear that if you don't have a good strategy, just about any design will work. So we sort of hone in on the importance of strategy. And we often get into conversations about, well, what if we don't have a strategy? And that turns out to be a fairly common issue and problem. And as a result, we think it's important that you have some tools for figuring out what the strategy is so that you can take a step forward with design. So we'll talk about some of that stuff. And different sort of environments result in different strategies. Different strategies are going to result in different choices around the STAR model about how you set up your structures and systems and processes. And the lines between all the elements of the star, those are important because those speak to how well aligned the different points of the star are. So in terms of work processes, the work the organization actually does, the capabilities that the organization has and what it can do, we want to know whether or not the structures that you choose focus attention and resources on that work. And you can choose a structure that gets in the way of doing work well, or you can use structures that actually help the organization get the work done. We look at those lines. I like to say the lines on the STAR model are there not to make it look pretty, but because there's really something going on. It would be, I see the question here, some of the senior leaders in my org are starting to look at the 7S. It'd be great during the workshop to discuss why it's better. And yeah, that's probably a conversation that's useful at the time. Like I say, I'll try and call out maybe a couple of differences in how we look at things. For example, I think the 7S embeds culture a little more than we do in our model. We try and look at culture as an outcome. So there are some differences, and it would be sort of useful to give people at least some working knowledge about the differences and strengths and weaknesses of different things. Ultimately, it's probably going to be a choice, and I think where Sue and I would probably end up with is the principles of looking at this as a whole system and being systematic about looking at the organization, whether it's service and staff and those different 7S's. You know, are those put together in a systematic way? That's probably the really important piece. But it's a great question. I'm going to start to go around the star now. I'm going to start to take a look at sort of each one of the pieces, just give some definitions, try and give a couple of examples to bring some of these pieces alive a little bit so that they don't look just like a bunch of definitions and descriptions. In your pre-work booklet, you should have some questions that relate to these bullets that we'll be talking about. And when we talk about strategy, that's the place where we start with design. It's really, we just feel it's absolutely crucial that the organization have a clear and shared strategy. So the strategy has to be clear, has to be, we have to understand what our objectives are. Those are the outcomes or the ends we're trying to achieve. And we have to be really clear about the means to the end. And the means to the end is the strategy. So what are those goals and strategies, those means and ends, and how do they fit together? To what extent do those means and ends respond to demands by the environment? So regulators are asking your organization to do certain things. Customers are asking your organization to do certain things. There are technologies available. There's technologies. Digitalization is changing the competitive dynamics in many industries. Is the goals and the strategy of the organization responsive to that sort of thing? So we want to be really clear about how that happens. I think the simplest way to think about it is strategy gives the organization a sense of direction. We're going to go this way, not that way. And getting clarity around that, we want to provide you with some tools so that, again, if the strategy isn't clear or shared, there's some relatively quick ways to get a first best guess at what the strategy is so that you can design against it. If your strategy is not clear, if it's not shared, then you're just kind of, shooting blanks with respect to the design and the structure of the organization because you've got no way to make trade-offs. That strategy gives you some opportunities to make trade-offs. So, different firms in different industries or different firms in the same industry are going to have different strategies. So if we think about, for example, fast-moving consumer goods, the way Unilever kind of goes about, achieving its objectives, it has a very strong kind of environmental bent to it. The sustainable living plan. We're going to double revenues and halve our environmental footprint. That's a real clear part of what Unilever's trying to do. Procter & Gamble, Nestle, some of the other, food, beauty care kinds of organizations, they're pursuing different objectives. The way they're trying to achieve their objectives is going to be different. And we want to come up with frameworks and tools and descriptions that allow us to make that differentiation, to say why my organization is different from somebody else and why that difference is valuable. And the more we can do that, the clearer we can do that, and the better we can describe a business model that describes the way we make money and how we're differentiated from firms, allows the organization to share that. When people share the model and understand it, they can understand their contribution, and we can begin to align the organization in terms of these systems, structures, and processes to make this strategy happen. So that's the beginning point. We spend the second half of the first day kind of exploring different parts of strategy. So we spend, again, kind of a whole half a day making sure that everybody kind of gets the linkage between strategy and environment, strategy and work, and the things that you got to do to design an organization to achieve a set of objectives. So that's our first one. The second one, at the top of the star, is work processes and capabilities. And let me just talk about work processes to begin with. Work processes are the activities the organization does that adds value. So each organization sort of takes in some kind of energy, resources, labor, capital, ideas. They take in lots of different inputs. And the way the organization manipulates those inputs, it does a set of activities, it does work that adds value to those inputs such that it creates products and services that somebody wants to pay for. They're willing to pay for it. So it's that transformation that happens between inputs and outputs that represents the work of the organization. I've been living in France the last couple of years and had a chance to sort of watch the champagne makers. And if you think about champagne making, there's growing the vines. That's a core work process. You have to grow the vines, take care of the vines, grow the grapes, make sure that they're protected. There's a whole set of work involved with growing the grapes. You have to harvest the grapes at the right time in the right way, compliant with legal obligations and things. You take the grapes and you move them out, and you have to crush them and make still wine out of them, and then do secondary fermentation to make the bubbles. So there's a whole vinification process there. That takes a certain amount of time and a certain set of activities. And then when the champagne is ready, you distribute and sell it. So, growing, harvesting, vinifying, distributing, those are the core work processes of a champagne maker. And you can make choices about this is part of strategy, right? You can make choices. I just want to be a grower. I don't want to deal with harvesting and vinifying. I just want to be a grower. Or you can be a champagne maker and buy your grapes from a champagne grower. Or you could be like one of the big houses, like a Moët & Chandon, where you grow grapes, buy grapes, harvest the grapes, vinify the grapes, distribute the grapes, market the grapes. You do all of those things. So those are that's the choices you have around the work processes that you do that add value for the customer. Okay? So if we look at these bullets, that's what we're trying to get to understand. At a high level, Sue's fond of saying, we're not talking about 1,000 stickies on the wall here. We're talking about, 3 to 5, 5 to 7 really key work activities that are adding value for the customer and some output that we think is going to be valuable. So there's major processes that are required to deliver value. Capabilities is just, if you take a look at how all of those work processes sort of get pulled together, and they begin to talk about what can your organization do, right? So if you're one of the big champagne makers, you can make champagne. You're totally self-contained in how you do that, and you can make champagne that is extremely expensive, and therefore you're going to charge a higher price for it because of the way you do that. Or you could have a certain capability that allows you to make relatively low-cost champagne. And it tastes great, but it's going to go after a different market than the very top-end kinds of champagnes. So you can have some champagne makers are great in going into foreign markets. Some champagne makers are really good staying in very local markets, even just France or just the EU. So you have choices about the capabilities, and you take those work processes and bundle them together to do some kind of big things, enter new markets, develop people. Their capabilities are a big organization ability to accomplish something that is relevant to the strategy. Again, notice the connection between strategy and the work capabilities, right? We like to say that the work processes and the capabilities, that's the manifestation of the strategy. Strategy tends to be kind of an idea, but when you get to the work processes, you actually get to see what that strategy looks like in the field, on the ground, in the factories, in front of the customer, when the salespeople are contacting things, how you're using technology. That's what the strategy sort of looks like in real terms. Moving around to core and lateral structure, one of the things we want to be sure you walk away with is the belief in the notion that organization design is more than structure. That doesn't mean structure isn't important. It's a terribly important piece of organization design because it begins to talk about how we're going to allocate resources and people and power in the organization. And we're going to talk about two kinds. We're going to talk about core structures. Are you functional? Are you divisional? Are you matrix? What are the choices you have for core structures? And these are the kind of the boxes that are drawn at the high, under the CEO. What are the boxes reporting directly to the CEO? Or if you're a business unit leader, what are the boxes directly reporting to the business unit leader? If you're the head of a function, what are the activities that are reporting directly to the leader of that function or unit or organization? And there's a logic, right? There's a logic in each of the choices that we make, whether it's functional or front-back or networked. A lot of people are talking about Zappos these days, and it's a network, and there's no hierarchy. And so, how do they get things done if there's no bosses? And so, we need to understand what those logics and choices are if we're going to choose different structures, different core structures in the organization. In addition to that core choice, which is, again, crucial, what we're going to suggest to you is that any choice of a core structure is never going to be perfect. There's always going to be, as soon as you say I'm going to be a geographically based core structure, somebody's going to ask you, what about product, and what about customers, and what about functions? And so for every choice you make for a core structure, you're going to have to balance that off with a trade-off, and you're going to have to think about how to laterally or horizontally integrate the units in the core structure. So if you've got a geography-based organization, you're going to have to think about how do you work the product dimension across geographies. And we call these lateral structures. And Sue's going to spend a good chunk of time on Wednesday talking about these and the lessons she's learned in working with lots of organizations doing this kind of stuff and helping people think about these lateral structures. It turns out that people are very comfortable working in a vertical core way. That's why we call them silos. People understand, if I'm in a marketing function, I understand how to do marketing because I'm talking to marketing people. But if marketing people then have to talk with manufacturing people and have to talk to the engineers, now we have different languages. And so it makes it a little difficult, and we have to actually consciously, intentionally design structures that move information across geographies or across products or across functions. And this is a special category of organization structure that is, I think, one of the strengths of our program, because just the work that Sue has done on these things is pretty amazing. Just look at the thing here to back up on the capabilities. Would you say capabilities and competitive advantage are similar? What you're going to do is you're going to try and create a set of capabilities that differentiate your firm and create competitive advantage vis-a-vis your competitors. So yeah, there's a relationship there. Some capabilities are, we call them zero order, because everybody has to have them. Everybody has to be good at recruiting people, hiring people, and paying people. You don't get to be an organization unless you have that capability. But that doesn't confer competitive advantage. What you are trying to do, based on your strategy and objectives, is choose work processes and capabilities that do differentiate you from your competitors and give you a competitive advantage. So there's definitely a linkage there, and we want to sort of use the strategy as the fountain, if you will, of the ideas that are going to represent the capabilities which make our organization different and better than others for certain objectives. So yeah, there's definitely a relationship, but I would say capabilities causes advantage. If I was going to put a little causal connection in there. Okay, So structure, core and lateral, absolutely critical. We spend a good chunk of time here because I think the reason we spend time here is what you need to know is that there are options. There's options for core structures. Obviously, a lot of people are talking more and more about networks because of the platforms, and digitalization is creating these platform strategies, and that's going to create a different set of structures that are more likely to be network-oriented. So do you know what the difference is between a functional structure, a divisional structure, and a network structure? So we're going to try and play with that a little bit. We want you to know that you've got alternatives. By the same token, there's lots of different ways to get that lateral coordination, that lateral integration accomplished in an organization, and we want you to be equipped with those options so that you can, you won't be stuck thinking there's only one way. There's actually multiple ways to get these things done, and we want to, make sure that you're aware of those different options. When we get to management processes, this is actually an area where there's a fair amount of work going on today, and we try and make this as simple as we can. And in some ways, it is fairly straightforward and simple, and that is we want to be clear: does the organization have a way to set direction? Strategy is what is the direction. But do you have a process for setting direction? And it's going to get called different things. It could be called strategic planning. It could be called capital budgeting. It could be, operational expense budgeting, resource allocation. Do you have a way to figure out, what the goals are? Who's got those goals? Do they own them? Do they align to the strategy? Are there metrics attached to them? Do we have resources and budgets so that people get the inputs and investment they need to accomplish their objectives? So there's a whole set of processes related to management processes that have to do with making sure the organization, sort of has a way of allocating resources and placing those resources against the strategy. So we'll talk about strategic planning and direction setting and things like that. We'll also talk about communication processes, because I think too many organizations leave communication to, well, people will talk to each other. Sometimes not. Better to be clear about what those communication channels are and what information is going to be communicated, how transparent is it going to be, and let's just sort of develop a framework that asks people to systematically think about who needs what information and how we're going to get it to them. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on communication processes, and then we spend a little bigger chunk of time on decision making and decision rights, and getting really clear about who makes a particular decision. And we think this decision rights issue is particularly powerful because it represents, again, kind of this blueprint for the way the organization operates when it comes to setting prices or deciding what new products to develop or who gets IT investment and who doesn't, and these different really kind of contentious decisions. Who makes the decision? In fact, Jay Galbraith used to make the joke, when he's flying in a plane and there's 2 or 3 pilots at the front of the plane, I don't want them, discussing, should we land the plane now? I want to know that somebody's going to make that decision. And so management processes represents the work managers do to align the organization, set direction, communicate, and move information around. How do we learn? How do we make decisions? And we try and use that as a way to talk about some of the glue that holds the organization together. It's a really cool little element of the STAR because it links the core and lateral structures with the rewards, and it helps tie all that stuff together. What's the goals? Do you get rewarded for it? Is it part of the responsibility and accountability of your role in the organization structure? It's a really cool little piece of the STAR that helps this integration happen. So we'll spend some time playing with that as well. The last two points of the STAR, rewards and performance management and people, get to this notion of, and I mentioned it at the beginning, at the top of the hour here, it's about figuring out what are the right rewards for the right behaviors so that our strategy is executed. And when we talk about rewards, we don't just mean financial rewards. So this also includes non-monetary rewards, recognition, thinking about status and culture in your organization and what constitutes a reward. I'm working with the French power company over here, and because it's a hierarchy, being asked to be on a task force with a fairly senior manager, getting the visibility with a senior manager, turns out to be a very powerful reward. And it's also, for the organization, it's a great way to look at talent and who are the high potentials, and does this person really look like they have the opportunity to advance in the organization. So it's a great reward on the one hand. It's also a great people development process and leadership development process on the other. But thinking about your organization and thinking what is powerful, what is rewarding, what is considered a positive expectation, a positive consequence of doing things is something we want to talk about. The reward system bubble is pretty complex because those rewards and recognition, again, financial and non-financial, they can be designed to address the individual. They can be applied at a team level. In other words, you know, I'm not so concerned with what individuals do. I want to know what the team does, and the team gets to work out, you know, how those rewards are distributed within the team. I can look at it at a business unit level. I can look at it at an enterprise level. And so there's different leverage points that you can use to decide what kind of reward you want. And is it producing the kind of motivation that is necessary for the strategy to be executed? Are you getting the kinds of behaviors that you're looking for? So we spend a good chunk of time, I think it's Tuesday afternoon, I think it is, talking about rewards and people together, but really kind of calling out the importance of rewards as a method for motivating the right behaviors, and trying to recognize that this is also a place where you can get in misalignment really fast, where you can reward certain behaviors that are not contributing to strategy or doing the work really well or the capabilities of the organization. So rewards becomes a really key aligner of different pieces of the STAR and thinking about how to pull things together. So we're going to put a chunk of time in on understanding the components of a reward system and how they align with the other parts of the STAR. And then finally, you get the people issues. And one of the things that we try and talk about in the course is, yes, everybody has to have a method and a strategy, right, for figuring out who are the right people, how do we find them, how do we recruit them, how do we hire them, how do we retain them, how do we develop them. And so there's a process there of finding, of identifying and bringing on board the right people that are going to be, you know, necessary to make the strategy go. Again, here in Europe, there have been some big regulatory changes in the French labor law, and those regulatory changes have kind of shifted the ability of businesses to hire and fire people. In France, it's been historically almost impossible to lay people off for any reason, whether it's good performance, bad performance, competitive conditions. And they've been making changes in the work code here, and pretty immediately, almost soon as that happened, the Renault car company started adjusting its workforce, and they announced that they were going to lay some people off, and of course that caused all kinds of problems among the unions here in France. But if you keep reading, what was critical for Renault was they were holding all of these people who had very, very old skills, and they had nobody. They couldn't hire people just because of cost. They couldn't hire people with new digital skills that was going to allow them to be more effective in the future. Electric cars, autonomous driving, they needed an infusion of a different set of skills, and so they're using this chance as an opportunity to shift the skill mix of their organization. Renault has a choice. They can announce those layoffs and do the layoffs with integrity and make sure the people are taken care of, have proper pensions, or retrained, or whatever. They have choices about how they do that. But the change in the regulation has caused Renault to think about the people point of the star and how are they going to match that. They have obviously they have some important choices in terms of reputation and social accountability, social responsibility, and how they do that. But here's a great example of how the environment changes. Organizations are now taking the opportunity to adjust their people skills and knowledge for competitiveness. And when we get into this people part, that's what it's about. It's also about leadership and management development and training, and making sure people have the appropriate skills and knowledge to make the strategy go, to make the work processes work effectively, to possess the right skills and knowledge and behaviors to make the structures work. So each of these points of the star serves a purpose in itself and serves a purpose in supporting other points of the star. So we want to begin to continue to talk about how alignment happens inside the organization among the points of the star. Okay? So that kind of gives you this set of descriptions about the model we're going to use, the framework we're going to use, and how we're going to talk about it during the session. And the reason we go through this as a pre-seminar is we want to talk about first principles, and the choices that you have with respect to each of these points of the star represents a choice about how you do things, and it represents a first principle set of knowledge about how to design organizations. There's been a lot of talk about design thinking in the world. Most of it has had to do with product design and experience design in service organizations. But we think about it, obviously, in terms of organization design. And if I think about design in a generic way, what we're talking about here is society has a set of problems or goals or challenges. There's obstacles or opportunities that present themselves that we would like to take advantage of or solve, whether it's global warming or poverty, or recognizing that, a lot of people fly back and forth between the United States and the European Union, and for face-to-face meetings and negotiations in the Davos World Economic Forum, and people want to meet face-to-face and talk about it, but the travel by airplane is a mess. It's the carbon footprint associated with airline travel is just amazing. And so how can we solve the opportunity or the problem of moving people back and forth? And that's the problem and the goal. And on the other hand, we have some solutions criteria. We have some constraints or some characteristics of the way we would like to see this problem solved. We would like to be able to move people back and forth between North America and Europe, or I'm just choosing that, obviously. We can go to Sydney, Australia, or Beijing, China, it doesn't matter. But we need to move people back and forth in some kind of way that's efficient, that reduces the amount of carbon, that gets people there faster, that uses less fuel, reduces our dependency. And so that represents a set of solutions criteria for solving the problem of allowing people from different countries and cultures and organizations to meet face-to-face. So that doing that and solving that problem under those solutions criteria creates some tension. It's really hard to solve that problem. And so the solutions concept becomes, what's the mode of transportation? You know, today we would think about it as an airliner or some kind of jet that does that. And so how can we design an airliner that does that, that solves that problem within that solutions criteria? Well, I think it's obvious. You know, I don't want to ask a baker to design an airplane. The baker understands the chemistry of dough and flour and water and yeast and heat, and they can make wonderful pastries and breads and different kinds of things, but they'd be lousy at designing an airplane. What I need to design an airplane is somebody who really understands the engineering aspects of aeronautical engineering, carbon fiber materials, jet engines. I mean, you look at the joint venture between GE and Safran here in France. They've got a new jet engine. I think it's called LEAP, which, you know, supposedly just really drastically reduces the amount of fuel, energy, and pollution and carbon footprint that happens during flight. So, you know, I need engineers to sort of figure that out. Applied to organizations, the truth is that people are coming out of business school, they're coming out of their MBA programs, and they're starting to run organizations, and nobody understands the principles of organization design. They understand marketing, they understand finance, they understand economics, they understand engineering and product design, but nobody's been taught how to put an organization together, people and structures and systems and goal setting and rewards in such a way that produces the things that we want an organization to be able to do. And when we don't understand the first principles, when we don't understand the elements of the star, we're producing organizations that make people sick at work. We produce organizations that are polluting the environment, that are causing communities to be, causing sadness in communities. We're producing products that make people unhealthy. We need to think about how we are going to apply our understanding and knowledge of structure, strategy, processes, systems, and rewards to produce organizations that solve the problems society has and do it in a way that works within the design criteria. And I think that's really what our program is about, is trying to equip you with that set of first principles so that once you understand the challenge and the opportunity in your organization, once you understand the design criteria and what we want that organization to be able to do, you're now in a better position to design, to come up with that solution for an organization that can be effective, be financially healthy, give people good work, provide good products for society. That's the kind of thing that I think we're looking for as an objective in this course. And we think the STAR model is a great way to think about those first principles. So with that, I'm going to stop, check in with everybody. We had a couple of questions on the chat, but before I talk a little bit about how to get the most out of the workshop, did my presentation, comments, jokes, anything there, give people any questions or want to make any comments that Sue and I might respond to?
Chris's phone just dropped, so he probably didn't see that question from you, Stephen. Sue, do you see that question?
Actually, no, but I can make it so I can see that question.
Hi there. I was just asking that now that we've walked through the STAR model, if we could return to the question about culture and its relationship to the STAR model,
oh, sure.
Now that we have a better understanding. Thank you very much.
Sure. We have actually a little section where we talk about this, and our going in premise, and one that we think gets supported over and over and over again in research and also in the experience of companies, is that culture really stems from how you are organized to do work, from your operating model. So if you are an operating model that works in segments and silos, and that's the way you're designed, that's the way the elements of the STAR are designed, and there's very little connection across those through planned and intentional lateral connections, and there's very little reward for collective performance. It's largely that people look at what did you do as an individual or as a unit, and if you don't actually have a really well-founded routine for putting people from different parts of the organization together, goaling them, holding them accountable, and giving them the skills to do that, all those things are parts of the way the organization is designed to operate, and it leads to your culture. And if you don't have any of those things, you're likely to be a very fragmented and segmented culture. So that's just an example of how you operate and are designed to operate shapes a culture. So culture is something that Ed Schein was the psychologist who dealt the most with this, and he was fond of saying you can't operate directly on culture. Culture is embedded, and it's not really at the conscious level. And so what you have to do is operate on the way in which people interact and the artifacts in the organization that give people the messages about how they're expected to act and how they're expected, that way of acting is expected to lead to what the organization's attempting to accomplish. So we think that by working on design, you're actually working on culture. A second question is, do you need to change the culture in order to work on design? Because you have an embedded legacy culture that you all are dealing, or many of you are dealing with. Some of you are from startup-type companies, but most of you are from companies with a very strong legacy culture. Will that get in the way of actually designing an organization that can operate in a different way and have a different culture? And the answer to that is yes, it can very much get in the way, and part of the art of being an organization design person is to plan everything so it operates towards the culture that you want to move towards and away from the culture that you want to move away from. So things like if you need to become a more inclusive culture, if you need to become a less fragmented culture, if you need to become a culture that treasures and values diversity, all those things, you need to actually design every single element of how you go about redesigning so that those things are front and center, and so that you empower voices that haven't been empowered historically in the organization. So by the way you design, as well as by what you design, you're having a very direct impact on culture. And we all know that in the last 5 years at least, CEOs have discovered culture and discovered that their culture doesn't support what they want to do. And often what they do as a result of that is have a big culture program. And that does raise in salience the assumed and embedded assumptions in the organization about how we operate. But what it doesn't do is change the organization in a way that a different way of behaving and a different culture is the natural result. So we're going to deal with how you actually design the organization to impact your outcomes, and our belief, and research really supports this, is that that will then lead to a very different way of behaving and a very different kind of culture in the organization. And I don't know if Chris got back on or not, but would you add anything to that?
I am.
Yes. Okay.
I am, and I'm certainly glad you're there. I'm certainly glad you were there. I apologize, everybody. The phone call just dropped. So, no, I think first it's a great question, right? It's one that we get all the time, and it's important that all of you have a really clear notion about even. I mean, Sue and I are obviously going to give you our opinions, our experience, and what the data and the research say. but it's also important that you have a clear view yourself. And our view is that, like Sue said, each of those points of the star sends a signal to people about how they should be behaving. And if those signals are mixed about what the right behaviors are, you end up with this sort of fragmented culture, a culture that maybe responds more to informal rewards rather than explicit rewards. And that star model is your best friend in thinking about culture change. There was an article literally in Forbes magazine, I think this week, which said that, you know, culture change should be on the agenda of every CEO. And I started reading it thinking, oh God, this is going to be so bad. But what the author ended up saying at the end was, here's 6 things you got to do. And I'm not going to get the 6 things exactly right, but one is reward the right behaviors. You know, structure the organization so that it's clear what people do. You know, have a clear vision and mission that relates to the environment, which is the strategy piece. So he went through 6 things that had nothing to do with changing the culture directly. It had everything to do with changing the elements of organization design, and I was pleasantly surprised to read that.
Yeah. And Beth Gunderson, who is our 3rd faculty member who is not on the call because she's on an airplane, is going to do about a 15 or 20-minute explanation of how finally General Mills realized that they couldn't just ask for an innovative culture and expect it to happen, even though they articulated it and got people to talk about why it's important to have an innovative culture. They had to actually plan their interventions and redesign the organization to allow that culture to be the prevailing culture.
Cool. Let me just we got a few minutes left here. I want to be sure that we talk about, you know, our suggestions, how we would suggest that you prioritize your time between now and when the workshop starts in early February. I think it was February 4th or 5th. You're going to, Sue and I are often accused of being fire hydrants. We kind of push a lot of information your way. You're not going to get cheated in terms of the amount of information. We're going to give you frameworks, tools, applications. So to get ready for that, right, having that pre-design, that organization design pre-work tool, what it asks you to do is sort of go through the STAR model, use the STAR model to do a diagnosis of some part of your organization that's of interest to you. It could be your whole organization. It could be a business unit that you work with. It could be the HR function. It could be a function that maybe that you're the business partner of or something. Think about an organization you want to sort of play with. You want to think about how it's designed and how it might be redesigned. And go through that tool and complete and do a little diagnosis about that organization. We're going to give you time during the session to say, okay, this is what I thought it was. Chris and Sue and Beth talked about these different things. Okay, how might I apply those ideas now if I were to redesign this organization? So having a good case in your own mind about a real live case in your mind, I think will help make the material that we present really relevant and applicable. We've asked you to do some pre-reading in terms of some cases. The pre-reading allows us to, again, leverage the time in the classroom so that you can discuss and debate different aspects of cases with your fellow colleagues in the workshop. So spend some time, briefing those cases and thinking about the questions that we ask at the end of each case. Does this sort of, what's going on in this organization, and what do I think about what's working and isn't working? During the course, I think almost every night, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday night, certainly Tuesday and Wednesday night, we give you like an article to read about something that we're going to talk about the next day. So know that even as we're having dinners and stuff, we'll often ask you to leaf through, brief yourself, skim an article that will make a conversation richer and we hopefully more relevant and applied for you the next day. So just kind of be prepared for that. We will be talking about first principles. We're trying to get a sense of what's the core knowledge base that you need to leave the organization and to leave the workshop and get back to your organization and do some of the work that's relevant. So start thinking now. You know, when you go back after this workshop, your head's going to be full of new ideas. Who can you share that with? Who can you bring into and sort of debrief and download what happened during the week, so that you can start to diffuse this knowledge in your organization and use it to make things better and get design going on your side and in your organization. Have we gotten the link to the tool? I have the email with the cases, but I'm not sure. So, Alice, how can you help?
Yeah, that was that yellow pre-workbook that was sent to everybody. That's the tool he's referring to when he says the design. It wasn't sent as a link. It's it was sent with a book by Jay Galbraith. So
it should be a physical thing. If you need if you didn't get that for some reason, drop Alice a note and maybe she can get you a soft copy of it to work on. Anything else? I think we've kind of reached the end of our time here. I hope this little pre-workshop webinar has been helpful and given you a chance to start thinking about some of the things we're going to discuss. And again, if there's any other questions anybody has before I can stay on here for a couple more minutes and answer some questions. Otherwise, we'll see everybody, again, like I say, is it February 4th or 5th?
February 6th.
Okay. We'll see everybody on February 6th.
And this is Alice. I just have one plug-in just to remind you to please send in your bio book pages if you have not done so already.
Oh, yeah.
I still have about a little bit more than half that I haven't gotten yet. So I know if I think I said January 31st, but sooner would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great way to learn about your participants and your colleagues in the workshop, and becomes a really useful community building and resource linkage, so you can share some of the knowledge and build a little support group there around org design. So.
Chris,
I bring
question?
champagne, yeah. Do I have to bring some for everybody? Yeah.
There will be wine at dinner on Tuesday.
There will be wine at dinner on Tuesday. That's good. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. If you got any questions, I think you have Sue's email, my email, and Alice's email. If you have any pre-work questions, by all means, shoot us a message, and we'll be happy to get everybody ready to go for February 6th. Okay? Thanks, Alice, for setting us up. Thanks, Sue, for pitching in while I went silent there. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.